So, welcome to the third episode or the third edition of our report card series. For right now, this is going to be the final one, but eventually we're going to come back and we're going to have the last segment will be the what was prepared for success and now is college career workforce ready. They're just still figuring out that component. So we're going to pause here for a little while. And then once that gets ironed out, we're going to include that in the series. So thank you everyone for joining. If you could, make sure you fill out the attendance link at some point today, and we'll make sure we get you a certificate of attendance for being here with us live. Today, we're going to focus in on achievement, graduation, and early literacy. So with that, the first part that we're going to talk about is achievement. And achievement, there were some changes that really affected this component, but they really weren't ginormous changes there. So the first thing, and this is kind of the biggest thing, the indicators met is now report only. So that used to make up 25% of the achievement grade. They've moved that to just report only. And we'll kind of talk about where you can see that. And that's your percent that are proficient or higher. The second change, and this one I think really helped us out, is the performance index max score is used or is determined by the top 2% of buildings or districts, depending on which type of report card you'll be looking at. So previously, they made the max always 120. And then they kind of realized that, hey, to be fair, let's look at what the top 2%, they really saw that with the pandemic. So they made that change. And now that max score is going to be determined by the top 2%. If you joined us for gap closing, we actually are using performance index, the same type of calculation. But when we look at our highest, that max score, it's a lot lower because when we looked at it previously in gap closing, we were just looking at performance index for gifted students. So in a second, we'll take a look at what those values were for this past year. And then one additional change is you're going to see a few new courses added in here. So biology was not previously part of performance index. All the students were required to take it, but they did not include it in performance index. It is now, as well as American history and American government. With that, there are a couple of things that your students could also use a replacement score if they are taking an AP course or if they're doing an IB course. So if they take the test in those courses, they can substitute their score from that test into the performance index that you have there. The one question that I get asked a lot about this is, what about my CCP students? When they wrote the law that changed this part of the component, they did not put anything in there for CCP. So those CCP students don't have to necessarily take the assessment. They won't be counted as untested. But they don't have to, they're not required to take the test there. Some districts do choose to have their CCP students also take the state test there so that their scores can be included in. That's a district decision there. Okay. The next thing, we really haven't talked about this in the other sessions, so I wanted to just mention it here today as we're going over this. The overall rating. So coming next year, there will be overall ratings. So what they'll do is they'll combine all of the different components and they will give you an overall rating. And that can be up to 5 stars. One thing that's a little different with it is it can also be half stars there. And what we were told in the past is they will figure that out this year for federal school improvement. So they're not going to necessarily post it or publish it, but those values are what the school is rated overall. They do factor that in so that they can create those watch priority focus schools for this year. Um, the next thing that you see there, as far as the overall, and this really is important for achievement and progress, they are weighted more than the other component grades. So they are weighted the highest. And the rule for that is that they have to be, each of them has to be double the weight of the other component. So when we talk about gap closing, which we just finished that series, graduation and early literacy, achievement has to be worth twice as much as those. The rating or how those are figured out, the percentages, those will change a little bit when college and career readiness pops in the coming years. But you will notice that regardless of when it is, progress and achievement will always be weighted the most. Okay, so let's take a look at what achievement looks like. So when we are taking our state tests, we have these different levels that you can score at, or performance levels here. The lowest weighted one would be untested. So if you have a student that should be taking a test and for whatever reason they don't, that's going to be our lowest rating, and that's a weight of 0. And then you can see as the performance goes up from limited, basic, proficient, accomplished, advanced, we're gradually adding weight there. So having students in those higher levels is going to be more beneficial, and it's going to give you a higher score. The advanced plus category, the way that students earn that is if they are in an accelerated course. So a lot of times we'll see that in a math course, maybe a student's in 7th grade, but they've been advanced to algebra, or they've been advanced to take an 8th grade course. What happens with those students is if they score proficient or higher, their level gets bumped up 1. So for example, if you have an 8th grade student that is taking Algebra 1 and they score advanced, they will move them up for accountability. It won't show on their home report or anything like that, but for the accountability piece of this component, they will be rated as advanced plus. And you can see that they get a little bit more weight than the advanced group. And then once we do that, we multiply our percentages at each of the levels by the weight that is assigned in the law there. And we get several different values for each group. We add them all up, and that is our performance index. So with that, then, the state came up with this scale that you see at the right here of how you can get 5 stars all the way down to 1 star. And what we're going to do is we're going to take our performance index, and if we just divide it by the maximum score, or the highest 2% of the school or buildings or districts in the state, depending on which report card we're looking at, that will determine which star rating you are. So for buildings for the 21-22 school year, the highest 2%, their average score was a 109.13. So in our example that we're looking at right here, if this was a building, then what we would do is we'd take our 97.462, we would divide it by 109.13, and we would get just below 90%. So that would be a 4-star rating. For districts, the average there was 107.254, and for the highest 2%. And if we divide there, we're just barely over 90%. So that would give us 5 stars. So you can see that depending on whether you're doing it for a building or for a district, you could get a different end result because the max score will be different for both of those. If you remember back to the last video that we did on gap closing, these numbers for the gifted students were in the 120s. I think the one was like 120 point something and the other one was 121. So there is, these are much lower than in the past when the average was 120, or they just always used 120 for this. Okay. In addition to that, we did mention that on the report card, you could see your percent proficient or above. And what we're looking at here is to the right on your report card. After you look at your performance index, you'll see that there's a spot that says indicators, and it will list all the tested areas that you have in the percent that were proficient or above. Okay. There's also, if you click over a tab, the comparison, you can see how your district did compared to I believe it's 19 other similar districts. So every year the state assigns 19 similar districts to you. You can see how they scored on the same tests, and then you can see the state average there. So at the top there, you can click through and pick a grade, and you can see the comparison between districts, similar district and state for math, ELA, and then when it comes to high school, you would throw in your history, your government, your biology as well. Okay. Now, also in here, if we look at on the left-hand side where we normally start out and it says calculation, one thing I like to click on there is where it says trend, and that is looking at your performance index. So you can see what the performance index for this district is, and you can also get an idea of, that the percent or the part of the whole there that scored at each of the levels. So you can see that after the pandemic, we really saw that limited category start to grow. And then it kind of went back down a little bit with what we're seeing right there. I really would love to see this by individual. So that's for all of the tested areas. If you go over to the right and you pick achievement levels, they do a very similar thing right there. And you can see the breakdown. It's really just for this year. So, and actually it's not going to be weighted. It's not going to give you that actual score, but you can see the percents that are at each level. I really wish they would give us something like what we see on the left there, and kind of a trend data that we could pick third grade ELA and then see what's happening across that. So that's one of the things that I'm hoping for in the future, but we'll wait and see if that happens. So that kind of wraps up achievement for today. So let's take a look then at the graduation component. So the graduation component really was the one that was least affected, or that there was the least number of changes when we switched to the new report card here. So with that, they take a look at your 4-year graduation rate. They also take a look at your 5-year graduation rate. So for the 4-year graduation rate, that is weighted a little more heavily. So it's going to make up 60% of your component weight. And then for the 5-year graduation rate, so they would go back and look. This is always going to be a year behind, but they go back and look the year before to look at that 5-year cohort. And that's only 40% of the component rate. Now, the one change that they did, and I'll kind of show you what this used to look like, is they used to figure out a grade for each of these and then apply the same percentages before they came up with a final grade. They kind of did away with that, and they just went straight from each of the graduation rates, weighted them, and then went straight to a final score there. So let's take a look at what they used to do. So this would be an example of a district. So their 4-year graduation rate was 94.4. Their 5-year was 94.8. So that 94.4, they looked at a scale and they assigned a letter grade for that part or that measure of the component. So in this case, on the old scale, that would have been an A. And because of where it was at on the scale, they would give them 4.25 points for that A. And again, those varied a little bit. So you gradually increased based upon how close you were to 100%. For the 5-year, Even though this was a little bit low or a little bit higher, the scale required a little bit more because it was a 5-year graduation rate. So you can see that on that old scale, a 94.8 for the 5-year graduation rate, that would have been a B, and that would have been a value of 4 for that. So we do a little math then, and we multiply that 4.25 times 60%, that 4 times 40%, and we come up with a score of 4.150. And based upon the scale that they used to have, that would have been an A. Okay, so as we go into the new way, you're going to see that it's a little more direct than that way right there. So we're going to use the same numbers there for comparison purpose. The first thing that we're going to do for that 4-year, we're going to take our 94.4%. We're going to multiply it by 60. We get a 56.64. Do the same thing for the 5-year, 94.8. Figure out what 40% of 94.8 is, and it's 37.92. We add those two together, and we get a 94.56. With that 94.56, we're going to go to our new rating scale, and the one change, other than like how they get to the final score, the one change that you're going to see here is the scale's more challenging. So it's a little bit harder to get that 5-star as it was to get the A. So with this, you needed a 96.5%. So this district right here is only going to receive 4 stars. So that's one of the things that you'll notice as you look at that scale. As you really dive into your graduation component, is you're going to notice that the scale did become more challenging for our districts, especially at that high end there. All right, so like I said, not a whole lot of changes, so we won't spend a ton of time on graduation. Actually, I lied. I forgot about this slide. So there are some report-only measures with this as well, and these were kind of limited this year as compared to what's coming. So I know one of the things that many of our districts were looking for is when they first presented these changes, they said, one of the things that you're going to see is you're going to be able to look at the report only part of this, and you're going to be able to tell, of the students that you had from the time that they were a freshman to the time they graduated, what was the graduation percent for those students? Because a lot of times, one of the things that plays in is that, moving in and out of a district can really have an effect on graduation. They're also going to have one of the things listed of those students that do move in. When they move in, do they have the same amount of credits, or are they on track with the number of credits needed to graduate with the other students in the building or in the district? So we're going to see some more things added to this. The reason that they couldn't put those in this year is because they really weren't tracking that information before the changes to the report card. So it's going to be delayed a little bit until they get all of that, the things that they need in place to be able to report that. All right, so now we're ready for early literacy. And this one, part of it stayed pretty close to the same. There were 2 new additions that are really going to change the way this early literacy component looks. So the first part, excuse me, the first part is they added proficiency on the 3rd grade reading portion of the OST to this component. So with that, and sometimes you're going to see it just reported as proficiency, but what they're looking at is they're taking the 3rd grade OST and they're just looking at the reading subscore there. To be proficient, a student needs to earn 50 points on that subscore. Some things to keep in mind with this is the alternate assessed students they're not going to be included in this measure. And the reason is they don't have a separate reading only portion of their test. So they don't have that information to report it. So they won't be included in this part of the component. Another thing to keep in mind is the highest score is going to be used for this. So if a student takes it in the fall and that's their highest, that's the score that's going to be used. But you can also use the spring and the summer administrations for a student to reach that 50 points for the being proficient there. So if they are participating in summer and they're taking the test, even though that's even later in the year, they will do everything they can to include that on the report card for this piece. And then students who are repeating the third grade do not get included in this part. So they would be removed from the calculation. Promotion to fourth grade. This one is pretty much what it sounds like. So they look at the percentage of students that were promoted to fourth grade. For many of our districts this year, that was 100%. And as you're looking at that, there was that piece that there was not a set score that they had to meet to be promoted. So as long as the teacher and the principal and the parent all agree that the student should move on, then that student could be promoted to fourth grade. So with that, we know that there are set standards for this year. As of right now, I just want to mention it. There is legislation currently in the legislature that is looking at possibly removing that fourth grade, holding a student back in third grade. So we don't know how that will affect this, but as of right now, even with the part last year that extra guidance or that you were able to count it as 100%, even if they did not meet a promotion score. All right, so those two pieces are brand new. We didn't use them in the calculation before. Previously, early literacy was just called improving K-3 literacy, which is the final part that we see here. So that is moving kids that are off track in 1 year based upon their diagnostic test to on track. So we're looking at moving them from off track to on track. One of the things that was an important part of this previously were RIMP deductions. So if you had a student in third grade who was not on a RIMP, they were on track, but then they did not score proficient on the third grade test, districts were penalized for that. That was removed. It was taken away. There are no longer RIMP deductions. However, we still need to put students on RIMPs that are in the off-track area there. So RIMPs are not removed or they're not eliminated. We're still doing RIMPs. They just don't count as deductions if a student isn't on a RIMP and they don't score proficient or higher on that test. And then the last part, this changed a little bit this year too. If greater than 90% of your kindergarten students are on track, this measure does not get calculated. So we'll talk about that a little bit more. This used to be a 5% here, a 95%. So if greater than 95% of your kindergarten students were on track, we didn't calculate this. You just didn't have this component on your report card. Now this is just a piece of the component. So you'll likely still have early literacy. You just might not have the improving K-3 literacy part of it. All right, so let's take a closer look at each of these and try to explain what's going on. So the first one is we're talking about the proficiency on the reading part of the language arts test. So we said 50 points. We can see here this district, they struggled a little bit. Only 33% of their students met that. Now, as far as weighting, we're going to put all these things together. So there's different situations where you may not have all of the measures included. So And our little situation that we're going to look at right here, we're going to assume that we have all three parts. So if you did have all three parts, you would get, this would count as 40% of the component grade. If you only had two, this happens often, especially if you don't have that improving K3 literacy component, then this jumps up to 60%. I really haven't found an example where this would be your only one, because usually this one and the next one that we talk about, which will be promotion, those two kind of go together. So I don't know that you'd see this as just the only one, but if you did, it would be 100% of your component grade. All right, so if we were to multiply those out, 33 times 40% is 13.2. So we're going to come back to that value a little bit later. All right, so here's our promotion. And for that, how many third graders met the third grade reading guarantee requirements for promotion? You can see this district 100%. Most of ours are very close to 100%, if not at 100%, when we're looking at their report card. So let's take a quick look at the weighting there. So if you have all three measures, this one's not quite worth as much. So it's only going to be worth 35%. So down a little bit. Now, if you have promotion and proficiency, so promotion is more weighted, so that would be make this one 40%. So it'd be a 60-40. If you didn't have proficiency, but you had promotion in K3 literacy, improving K3 literacy, again, I don't know that that's possible, but if that did happen, you would be at 60% for this measure. And again, if this was your only part, then it would count as 100%. I think those top two are likely you're going to see those more than you would see those bottom two. Okay, so let's take a look at what we have. We have 100. We're going to multiply it by 35%, and we get a value of 35. So we're going to add that in as soon as we finish talking about the next piece. Okay, so that brings us to the third part of this measure for early literacy, and that is improving K3 literacy. So previously, this was 100% of, it actually was just called improving K3 literacy at one point in time. So for that, it's now been reduced. It's a smaller portion, and there were those small differences that we'll talk about when we get to the first of which, and this is a big one because if we have 90% or more of our students on track, which means that less than 10% are off track, when they come in on their kindergarten diagnostic, that we will not calculate this part of the measure. So we will not do the improving K3 literacy here. With that, you can see in our example here, we have 90.7 are on track, and that means that less than 10% of them are off track. So at that point, we'll see this little message appear to the right, and then that will not be calculated in. So if you're a district or if you're a building that has third grade in it, you would just have the promotion and the proficiency part of this calculation. If you're a K2 building, you would have then just this, you would not have this measure at all, I should say. So that is one thing to consider or to keep in mind. If you do see that there, what they're looking at is just that current year kindergarten diagnostic, and then we would skip the rest of the things that we're going to look at here. With that, since I want to show you how this is actually calculated out, we're going to assume that we are not a building or a district that has more than 90% of our students coming in on track for that kindergarten diagnostic. So let's take a closer look at how we calculate the early literacy component for improving K3 literacy. So the example that I'm going to use is going to always have 10 students just to make it easy for us. And then what we're going to do is we're going to start by looking at the fall 2020 diagnostic. And so this was not last year's kindergartners. This was the year before. So with that, you can see right here that I'm going to use red shirts to identify that a student is off track. Green shirts are going to mean that when they took their diagnostic, they were on track. So for our example here, we had 4 students that were off track, and we had 6 that were on track. Now we're going to follow those 4 students that were off track, and we're going to figure out what did they do when they retook their first grade diagnostic the following year. So for this, we can see that those 4 students that we had, 3 of them are now on track in first grade, which is great. So that is the value that we're going to use in our calculation. So we have 3 students that we moved to on track. Previously, there were 4 students that were off track. Now, before I go any further, I want to address these 6 students right here. So because they were on track in kindergarten, they will not be used in this calculation. This happens. Let's say one of these students became off track when they took their first grade diagnostic. They will not be included in this year's data, or what we're looking at here, our numbers that we're looking at, they will not be included in that. However, because they're off track, when we turn around the following year, they will be included. So we're always just looking at the students that are off track in the previous year and what happened to them after that. So if we figure out percentages, and we'll see that, I believe it's to the right here, or sorry, to the left. If you click on the tab that says details of the measure, so you will see that year 1, and that's what's represented here when we go from kindergarten to first grade, that's considered year 1. 75% of our students that were off track moved to on track, and 25% stayed off track. So that is year 1, kindergarten to first grade. So now let's look at the next grade level. So in 2020, our first graders, you can see here, we have 6 first graders that were off track by the red shirts. When they moved to second grade and took their diagnostic, 2 of them moved to on track. So 2 out of the 6 moved to on track. If we figure out a percentage there, we got 33%, 67% for year 2. So we'll see that that is year 2. Again, this can be found where details of the measure tab, if we were to click on that. Okay. We're going to move up a grade level again. So fall 2020, these are our second graders. And we can see that we have 5 red t-shirts there. And those 5 red t-shirts mean that they're off track. When they move to third grade, so fall 2021, third grade diagnostic, of those 5, 1 of them moved to on track. So we get a 1 out of 5, and that's a 20% moved from off track to on track, 80% still off track. Okay, so now those are pretty simple because we're doing the same thing on all of them. The next change is a little bit different. So notice this time that it says fall 2021 third grade diagnostic. So for this starting point, we're looking at the third grade diagnostic. We have 4 students that are off track. I know my numbers don't quite match up from the previous one, but again, we're just using an example here. So let's assume that there were only 4 that were off track to make this easy. And of those 4, we're now going to compare to their OST score. So for their OST score, they can use their fall test, their spring test, or their summer test, whichever is higher. And we're comparing those 4 students that were off track on the diagnostic, and we're tracking to see if they became on track based upon their OST. To be on track for the OST, you have to score 700. You have to score 700 on the as your scaled score there. So we can see that 3 out of our 4 in our example here, 3 out of our 4 moved to on track based upon that. And so that is identified as year 4, 75% are moved to on track, 25% are off track still. All right. So now that we have all 4 of those years put together, what we're going to do is we're going to combine them and come up with an overall. So we have our year 1 here, kindergarten to first, year 2, first to second, year 3, second to third. Those were the ones that we said were normal. They followed a pattern. And then when we get to year 4, that's where we're going to do our 3rd grade diagnostic to 3rd grade OST. Now, at the time I'm recording this, it's October, towards the end of October. For next year's report card, most of this diagnostic stuff is already done. So you'll have an idea of what your score will be on parts of this. We obviously have not taken our 3rd grade OST for fall, spring, or summer yet. So we can't get a final, we don't know the whole part of it, but a lot of this data we'll already have figured out. Now, what happened in the past here is that this would be the point where we would add them all up. And we can see that out of all of our students here, 9 moved to on track, 19 of the students started out off track in our example. And here's where they previously would give us RIMP deductions. So if we had any students that were on track based upon their 3rd grade diagnostic this year, and they did not meet that 700 score, then they would subtract that number off of our 9 here. They have eliminated that. So we will no longer have the RIMP deductions there. So what we can do is we can go ahead and figure out a percentage for this 9 out of 19. So if we were to divide that out, we'd get 47.37%. And then our next step, what we would do is we determine what weight this is. So that's going to depend upon how many different parts of this measure you have for early literacy. So in our example, we're going to use 25 here because we did a promotion, we did a proficiency, and we have K3. I'm not really going to talk about these middle 2 because I don't know that we would see them very often where you have proficiency but you don't have promotion. So I'm going to skip over those for right now and talk about this only improving K3 literacy. So this is going to affect our K1 buildings and our K2 buildings. So for those of you that are in those buildings, this is going to make up 100% of your score for early literacy. And for that, if you're a K1 building, you're really only going to have this first row. So the entire component is made up of that first row. Or if you're a K2 building, you'll have these first 2 rows. With that, we know that several, and we were on a call, Tom Nunziato and myself were on a call the other day, and they had mentioned that be aware of that. If you're in one of those buildings, that this is just a small piece of what the entire component is. I think they've heard from several people about how this is negatively affecting their report card score. And we really didn't hear anything, but just know that If you're just have this small piece, that doesn't necessarily totally reflect what's going on as far as K3 literacy in your building. So be prepared to share that with your stakeholders of all the things that you're doing to work to get those kids on track. But again, it's just a small piece of what was intended to be the full picture of early literacy there. So I know that doesn't really help as you're looking at it, and it's very frustrating to see a 1-star or a 2-star there. But just know that it's not the entire picture, and just be able to share all the great things that you're working on to try to improve that K3 literacy in your building if you're in one of those K1, K2 buildings. So in our situation here, we'll go back to that and we'll take the 47.37% or 47.37. We'll multiply it by our weight of 25% and we'll get a value of 11.84 that we will put together with our other two measures, which you can see I have calculated out here. And when we add everything up, we're going to get a total of 60.0 points. Or 60.0, we could call that percent of all the points there that were possible. And we can see here is our rating scale. So we would have needed an 88% to get a 5-star rating. And we actually fell right here at the 2-star rating. So we fell between that 58 and 68%. So for our early literacy component, we would receive a 2-star rating. All right, so that is going to wrap up early literacy as far as a rating. So there's a couple things that I want to point out to you that you may want to take a look at, or as you're looking at this, to go a little bit deeper with. The first one is this whole idea of this 90% or more of the students being on track for kindergarten. So as you're looking at that, one of the things that we see there is that those buildings that don't have this may be one of the lower ratings in this component for you. So I took a look at, there were 91 buildings that earned a 5-star rating, and 86.8 of them did not have this K3 improvement. There were also a couple of districts that I looked at that earned this 5-star rating, but had they included this part, they probably would not have earned that 5-star rating. So if you're one of those districts that is falling into this and you got a 5-star rating or a 4-star rating, and you did really well, but you didn't include this off track to on track, you may want to still take a look at those and notice, all right, are we moving our kids that are off track to on track, and pay close attention to that to give you a more clear picture of everything that's happening with K3 literacy in your building or in your district. So just because it's not there or not included, please still take a look at those measures to see what's going on for your building or district. All right, the next one, we took a look at this chart earlier as we were determining if our building qualified for that not being calculated because we had 90% or more of our students were on track. So this is taking a look at on the diagnostic. This includes all of our students that took the diagnostic. What percent were on track, what percent were off track. So as you're looking at this chart, this kind of is a good way to look at your tier 1 instruction. So is my tier 1 instruction working? And I can tell that because this is all of the students there. As you're looking at that, I'm going to skip a slide here and I'm going to jump to this slide. Now, at a quick glance, these two slides look very similar. So this one is the details of the measure. And this is what we looked at the bottom of each of the t-shirt pages where we are determining the students that were moving from off track to on track. So I don't want you to confuse these two. This one is more looking at, are your interventions working? So with that, as you're taking a close look, it's easy to get those two confused. Details of the measure, that's what's actually being calculated, and that's telling you, are you moving your students off track to on track? So think of that as interventions, whereas the diagnostic one, we're going to think of that as our tier 1 instruction, the effectiveness of that. All right, so I probably should have went over this first. One important thing to think about as you're looking at all the areas of the report card is the idea of chronically absent students. And we know that this was not included in the report card this year, so it will return next year. It is a small piece of the gap closing. So we talked about that in video 2 of this series, but it does have a big impact on all the areas of the report card. So as you're looking at and evaluating your early literacy, it would be very important to pay attention to your percentage of students that were chronically absent. You can see that this district right here had a really high chronic absenteeism rate. They may have some great things in place for early literacy, but if they have a large percentage of their students that are not there, how effective will those be? The other thing that I want you to be careful of as you're looking at this is notice that this is for possibly the whole district. So if you're looking at the whole district, you may have to dive into this a little bit and make sure or look at, okay, what is our chronic absenteeism for the K3 grades there, and what can we do to improve that so that our interventions and things like that will have the effect that we're hoping that they'll have, and our tier 1 instruction will have the effect that we're hoping that it has there. Okay, so chronic absenteeism, just because it wasn't calculated this year, don't rule that out or don't ignore that. And just because it's over in gap closing, it's still okay to go and look at that as you're investigating the other areas of your report card. Okay, so we talked about this details of measure is really taking a look at, are those interventions working? This next piece is an important piece as well, is this data accurate? So this data, or this part of the report, comes from EMIS. So in EMIS, we have to identify our students and we have to say whether they are on track or off track based upon their diagnostic test. So every year, I shouldn't say every year, but occasionally I'll get somebody that reaches out and they'll say, hey, I don't think that this looks right. And usually where they'll want to go there is they'll want to look in their EMIS data or check with their EMIS coordinator to make sure that the information is matching up there that was entered. For example, as we look at this district right here, for their year 1, their year 2, and their year 3, they were all 0% of their students moved to on track. So 100% of them stayed off track. And that may be accurate, but it may be something that you just want to look at. So if you're looking at the details of the measure and you're like, I don't think that's right, that might be a discussion to have with your EMIS coordinator to see what information is being entered in EMIS. All right, and then the last one that we're going to talk about is looking at your how reliable is your diagnosis. So one of the things that we can see here is we can see this is the let me back up to the whole picture here. This is the on track by grade level. So we're looking at that report again. I know it's a little confusing because they do look so similar. So on track by grade level tab. And if we look at the 3rd grade diagnostic, this district or school had 76% that were on track. So hopefully what we'll see here is that when they actually take the test, that number is pretty close to what they actually did. So in this example, it just happened that they were right on. So the 3rd graders that were proficient on the reading part of the reading segment of the OST was 76%. So that matched up very closely. If you're finding that your diagnostic is telling you that like 90% of your students are on track, but then this number over here is much lower, that may be something that you want to look at. Is that diagnostic telling you what you're looking for, or is it really identifying those students that should be on track or off track there? So just something to take a look at as you're making some decisions going forward. So those are just some things that we thought we would bring to your attention. With that, again, for our series here, we've had a video on progress. You can see the link right here. If you'd like to go back and watch that video, there is also a video on the changes to gap closing with the link there. I will update this as soon as we put this together and clean this video up a little bit, and there will be a link in the presentation here for this recording that you're viewing right now. So I'd like to just take a second and thank you all for joining us for today's session. Whether you're watching this in a recording or whether you're here with us live, we really appreciate you jumping on and learning more about the changes to the report card. One of the things that we will say, there probably will be an addition to this series coming down the line. We really haven't talked about college, career, military, and workforce readiness. That is the old Prepared for Success. We know we're going to have a couple of years of report-only data for that. So as that component gets a little more ironed out and we're a little more certain of what it looks like, we will add an update for you to this series. I went ahead and put my contact information in there. So if you have any questions, or if I can be of help in any way in explaining or walking through your report card with you, please feel free to reach out. Always happy to help. And again, thank you for being with us over this video and the others. We really appreciate your time.